By 1974, Portugal had been fighting three brutal wars simultaneously for 13 years straight. Three wars that would cost thousands of lives, drain the nation's resources, and ultimately bring down a 48-year-old dictatorship. Today, we're diving into the story of how Portugal's empire collapsed not through peaceful negotiation, but through guerrilla warfare, military exhaustion, and a revolution sparked by carnations. While Britain, France, and Belgium were busy decolonizing Africa in the 1960s, Portugal stubbornly held on. Antonio Salazar's regime refused to let go of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. These weren't just territories to them, they were overseas provinces, integral parts of Portugal itself. But the winds of change were already blowing across Africa, and Portugal was about to get hit by a hurricane. The trouble started in 1961, not with diplomats or politicians, but with machetes and determination. February 4, 1961, Angola. A group of Angolan revolutionaries stormed Luanda's main prison, trying to free political prisoners. The attack failed, but it sent shockwaves through Portugal's colonial administration. This wasn't supposed to happen in their peaceful overseas province. But that was just the beginning. On March 15th, the real explosion came. In northern Angola, the UPA, Union of Peoples of Angola, launched coordinated attacks against Portuguese settlers, plantations, and government installations. The violence was shocking and brutal. Portuguese families were massacred, and the colonial authorities responded with equal savagery. The death toll climbed into the thousands in just the first few months. Portugal suddenly found itself fighting a war it never saw coming, but Angola was just the first domino to fall. By 1963, the fire had spread to Guinea-Bissau. The PAIGC, African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, began their own guerrilla campaign. Led by Amilcar Cabral, a brilliant strategist who understood that this war would be won in the minds of people, not just on battlefields. Then came 1964, and Mozambique joined the fight. Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front, opened their third front against Portuguese rule. Portugal, a small European nation with just 9 million people, was now fighting three simultaneous wars across an area larger than Western Europe. The numbers were staggering. Portugal eventually deployed over 150,000 troops to Africa. Nearly 40% of all Portuguese men served in these colonies. For a country that size, it was an enormous drain on manpower and resources. These weren't conventional wars with clear battle lines. The Portuguese found themselves fighting ghosts. In the dense forests of Guinea-Bissau, PAIGC fighters would strike Portuguese convoys and disappear into the jungle. In Mozambique's bush, Frelimo guerrillas turned every village into a potential base, every path into an ambush site. The Portuguese military doctrine was built for European warfare, not for chasing shadows through African terrain. They controlled the cities and major roads during the day, but at night, vast areas belonged to the guerrillas. In Angola, the situation was even more complex. Three different liberation movements, MPLA, FNLA, and later UNITA, were fighting both the Portuguese and each other. The Portuguese actually managed to exploit these divisions, but it meant fighting multiple enemies simultaneously. The psychological toll was devastating. Portuguese soldiers, mostly young conscripts, found themselves in a war they didn't understand, fighting an enemy they couldn't see for a cause many questioned. Letters home told stories of fear, confusion, and growing doubt about the war's purpose. Back in Lisbon, Salazar's regime tried to maintain the facade that everything was under control. They called it the overseas war, not a colonial conflict. In their propaganda, they were defending Portuguese civilization against communist terrorists. But the reality on the ground was different. By 1968, when Marcelo Caetano replaced the aging Salazar, the wars were consuming nearly half of Portugal's national budget. Young men were fleeing the country to avoid military service. The economy was stagnating while other European nations prospered. Caetano introduced some reforms, but he refused to consider independence for the African territories. He was trapped between hardline colonialists who wanted total victory and a war-weary population that wanted it to end. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the Portuguese military itself. Officers who had served in Africa began to see the futility of the wars. They watched as their men died for territory they would inevitably lose, fighting populations that clearly wanted independence. In Guinea-Bissau, the situation was particularly dire. By 1973, PAIGC controlled most of the territory and had even declared independence. gaining recognition from over 80 countries. The Portuguese were essentially trapped in fortified towns, unable to venture into the countryside without massive military escorts. These Africa veterans began to organize. They formed the Armed Forces Movement, MFA, a secret organization within the Portuguese military. Their initial concerns were professional, better conditions, career prospects, fair promotions. But their real motivation was ending the unwinnable wars. April 25, 1974. At 12:20 a.m., Radio Club Português played E Depois do Adeus by Paulo de Carvalho. To most listeners, it was just a song, but to the MFA conspirators, it was the signal to begin Operation Historic Turn. The revolution was swift and almost bloodless. By mid-morning, rebel forces controlled key points in Lisbon. Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano surrendered to General Antonio Spinola, reportedly saying, "I surrender power to the general, so it won't fall into the streets." But here's the iconic moment everyone remembers. As news of the coup spread, thousands of people flooded the streets of Lisbon. Someone, history doesn't record who, began putting carnations into the muzzles of soldiers' rifles. The image of armed soldiers with flowers sticking out of their guns became the symbol of the Carnation Revolution. The crowds chanted, "The people united will never be defeated," and sang songs banned under the dictatorship. After 48 years of authoritarian rule, Portugal tasted freedom. But the revolution's impact went far beyond Portugal's borders. The new Portuguese government immediately announced its intention to grant independence to all African territories. After 13 years of war, the conflicts ended virtually overnight. But the transition wasn't smooth. In Guinea-Bissau, independence came quickly in September 1974. The PAIGC had already proven they controlled most of the territory, so the transition was relatively straightforward. Mozambique followed in June 1975, with Frelimo taking power as the country's first independent government. Angola was a different story entirely. With three competing liberation movements, Portugal essentially abandoned the territory without ensuring a stable handover. The result was immediate civil war between MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, a conflict that would rage for nearly 3 decades and draw in Cold War superpowers. The numbers tell a story of tremendous suffering. Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 100,000 people died in the Portuguese colonial wars. Portuguese military casualties were around 8,000 killed, with many more wounded. But African casualties were far higher, tens of thousands of fighters and civilians. Beyond the dead and wounded, the wars displaced millions. Entire communities fled their homes to escape the fighting. The colonial economy, built on forced labor and resource extraction, collapsed in many areas. For Portugal itself, the wars consumed a generation. Nearly every Portuguese family had someone who served in Africa. The psychological scars lasted for decades. Many veterans struggled with what would later be recognized as PTSD, but in 1970s Portugal, these mental health issues were largely ignored. Portugal had been the first European power to establish a global colonial empire, beginning with the conquest of Ceuta in 1415. It was also the last to give it up, nearly 560 years later. The colonial wars marked the end of European colonialism in Africa. When Portugal finally withdrew, it closed a chapter that had begun with Portuguese explorers rounding the Cape of Good Hope in the 15th century. But the story doesn't end with independence. The newly independent nations faced enormous challenges. They inherited economies designed to serve colonial interests, not local needs. They had limited educated populations because colonial authorities had restricted African education. Most devastating of all, Angola and Mozambique immediately plunged into civil wars that would last decades. The Portuguese colonial wars offer several crucial lessons about the nature of empire and resistance. First, they demonstrated that even small, determined populations could defeat much larger colonial powers through guerrilla warfare and international support. The African liberation movements proved that colonial control ultimately depended on local consent, not just military force. Second, they showed how colonial wars could destroy the colonizing power itself. The wars bankrupted Portugal, corrupted its military, and ultimately brought down its government. The cost of empire became greater than its benefits. Third, they illustrated the Cold War's role in decolonization. The liberation movements received weapons and training from the Soviet Union and China, while Portugal counted on NATO allies for support. global superpower rivalry played out in African battlefields. Finally, they revealed the tragic human cost of delayed decolonization. If Portugal had negotiated independence in the early 1960s, like other European powers, thousands of lives might have been saved, and the transition to independence might have been smoother. Today, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau are independent nations, but they still bear scars from their liberation wars. Angola discovered vast oil wealth, but spent decades in civil war. Mozambique struggled with poverty and more civil conflict. Guinea-Bissau remains one of the world's least developed countries. Portugal itself transformed dramatically after 1974. The Carnation Revolution brought democracy, European integration, and economic modernization. The country that once spent half its budget on colonial wars became a prosperous member of the European Union. But the memory of the colonial wars remains complex in Portugal. For some, they represent a tragic waste of life and resources. For others, they're part of Portugal's historical identity. The debates about this period continue to shape Portuguese politics and identity today. The Portuguese colonial wars ended not with treaties or negotiations, but with exhaustion and revolution. They proved that no empire, no matter how determined, can survive when its own people lose faith in the imperial project. In the end, it wasn't African guerrillas who brought down Portuguese colonialism. It was Portuguese soldiers who decided they'd had enough. The last European empire fell not to external enemies, but to internal revolution. And it fell with carnations in rifle barrels, a powerful symbol that sometimes the most profound changes come not through violence, but through the simple act of choosing humanity over ideology. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's forgotten conflicts, hit that like button and subscribe to Wildorian for more stories about the forces that shaped our world. What other colonial conflicts would you like to see covered? Let me know in the comments below.